Welcome to our webinar on moving to France, sponsored by Blevins Franks. My name's Karen Tate. For the past 20 years, I've been editing French property news and attending our property exhibitions. I'm joined today by our experts, Mike Marsden of Blevins Franks, Joanna Leggett of Leggett Immobilier, and Helen Harrop of Agence AXA International. We'll start with some information from each of them about what they do, and then we'll move on to some of the many questions you've already sent in. You'll be able to submit questions while we're live. Sorry if we don't get around to answering them all, but you can get in touch with us via email afterwards. We'll also have a couple of polls running during the webinar for you to answer if you wish. And the webinar will be recorded and sent to you afterwards by email in case you've missed anything or want to watch it again. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Marsden, a senior partner with Blevins Franks. We're tax and wealth management advisors to UK nationals living abroad. Now, I've been resident in the southeast of France and working with Blevins Franks from our offices in Valbonne and Monaco now for the last 14 years, all the time with the aim of turning clients' dreams into an affordable reality.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Must be awful having to work in Monaco and Valbonne.
It was stormy yesterday.
Yeah, and Joanna? I think Joanna may possibly have frozen for a second, so we'll go over to Helen. Helen?
Hi, I'm Helen Harrop. I work for AXA Agence International as a health insurance specialist, and we're a specialist dedicated English-speaking insurance agency. We work with the whole of France and work with insurance and banking for our clients to help them get the best products they need, and we have access to kind of everything that people in that particular situation need. I've lived in France for 8 years. I moved across to the southwest, so they're just outside Toulouse, with my husband and my three what were younger children at the time, but kind of nearly all grown up now.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. Joanna, can you hear us? We've lost Joanna, so we'll come back to her in a bit and we'll start on some of the questions. Mike, we've been asked, can you summarise the extent of all the potential taxes? We've got Joanna back. Shall we? I'll go over to Jo. You can give us spoke too soon. Sorry, everyone. We'll get back to the questions. Mike, as I was saying, we've been asked, can you summarise the extent of all the potential taxes that might be payable for buying and living in France? Now, this could obviously take up the whole of the webinar. It's a very complicated subject, but is it possible just to give an overview of taxes people should be aware of?
Well, I'll do my best, because I think in general terms, when we're talking about property and France in a nutshell, France is an expensive place to purchase property compared to the UK. And for those considering doing so, it should be viewed as a long-term investment and great care taken over the selection process. With the legal costs and duties typically in the order of 7 to 9% on top of the purchase price, we need to be sure that and confident that there will be growth in value. Now, in addition to that, there may be future tax declarations necessary on one or both sides of the channel, covering matters such as capital gains tax on both sides of the channel when assets are sold, income tax, again, on both sides of the channel, particularly if there's French rental income concerned, and UK rental income. We have social charges, which is just a French issue, but nevertheless has an impact on our income streams. And it's a layer of tax on top of the standard income tax rates and capital gains tax rates. And then we have, of course, the dreaded wealth tax, which is different comparing France to the UK, and something that all our listeners now and participants need to be aware of. Now that's from a general point of view in terms of the tax issues, but in terms of local taxes, there's more to come. We have taxe foncière and taxe d'habitation, although the second one is being phased out. And they're similar to rates and other service charges in the UK. But of course, if we're renting our property out or if we've got business premises, the local taxes may well be at a higher level. So in a nutshell, that's where we are with the French, the tax situation in France compared with the UK.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And when you say property is expensive in France, you mean the property, some of the costs involved, the fees, actual property, maybe not in the south of France, but across lots of France is very affordable.
No, the property values are one thing. It's more the duties and other taxes on top that are expensive compared to the UK, that's all.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. Hi, Joanna, good to see you back.
Yeah, sorry, I'm in a hotel and I've had to reconnect through the phone because the internet connection's not very good.
No problem, these things happen, the wonders of modern technology. Perhaps you just could give a quick overview of yourself.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm Joanna Leggett. I'm part of the Leggett family from Leggett Immobilia. We're a family business. We were established in 1998, so I've been running for about 22 years now. We've got over 700 agents and we cover most regions in France, so from Normandy and Brittany all the way down to the Côte d'Azur and across to the Alps. We offer a hand-holding service, so we will help you from start to finish, selling or buying, sort out your electrics, help with translations, and obviously we've got clients coming over all the time now, which is good since it's all opened up.
Lovely, thanks, Joanna. So I'll give you a question straight away while you've got you. Somebody has asked how long the process usually takes for buying a home in France and what does it involve?
Well, usually it takes sort of between 3 to 5 months, probably maximum. Usually what would happen is you would come along, put in an offer on a property. Once that's been accepted, the compromis de vente is drawn up pretty much straight away. So it could be drawn up within a few days if all the paperwork's in. We need all the diagnostic tests done by the vendor. So that would include septic tanks, lead paint, electrics, that type of thing, and FOSS reports. Once that's all been signed off and you've actually seen it, then the buyer would sign the compromis and then the vendor would sign the compromis. Then there's a 10-day cooling off period for the buyer, but not for the vendor. After that 10-day cooling off period, the buyer would need to send the 10% deposit to the notaire. The notaire would then hold that in the notaire's holding client account until the sale completed. You can put suspensive clauses in the compromis de vente, and obviously if they're not met, or for any reason, for example, if it was a mortgage and it was refused, you would receive your 10% deposit back. If it's not refused and all the suspensive clauses are met, then you would need to carry on with the sale. The vendor doesn't have 10 days cooling off, so it's only the buyer that gets the 10 days cooling off period. Then during the next sort of 2 to 3 months, the notaire will make all the necessary searches as a normal solicitor would do in the UK, and all the land searches, etc., etc. And then after that period, you'd be expected to obviously sign the final act. In the old days, before COVID, the vendors and the buyers would both be in the notaires and sign it at the same time, but obviously things have changed. But that's generally the process. It's about a 3-month process at best.
Great, thanks for that, Joanna. And a crucial difference between France and England, for example, is that contracts are signed early on. So it's very reassuring for buyers once you've agreed and signed that contract, apart from the 10 days cooling off period. You are both locked into it and you're not going to get gazumped.
No.
Okay, one for you, Helen. We've been asked a lot of questions about healthcare for people who are moving to France, specifically about health insurance. Can you explain a little about how the French healthcare system works and how it differs to the UK? And is it different if you're working or retired in France? And someone else has asked, what is the guideline cost of health insurance for a couple in their late 50s, 60s?
Okay, another big question with a lot of detail behind it. I think for anybody moving from the UK specifically, the biggest change they will notice is that the French health system is generally not free at point of access. there's a series of set costs that are associated with all transactions in the French system, and they're set by the government, and the government, through the receipt of a social security number, will reimburse a percentage of those set costs. And that's generally 70%, but can be much less than that and can be up to 100%. And one of the biggest things for people to be aware of is that the real cost that you pay can be higher than that set cost. And therefore, this is where you can come across a mutual top-up insurance policy. The system is the same for everyone, whether you're French or whether you're moving to France, or whether you're working or self-employed or retired. The reimbursements you receive against your social security number will be the same for everyone. There's many ways to enter the system, whether you're working or whether you register as self-employed for a social security number, or whether you have an S1, for example, if you're retired and moving from the UK. Once you have your social security number, then you need to think about the possibility of having a mutual top-up policy which can help meet all these additional costs, the extra 30%, the additional costs which are not necessarily covered by the state at all, since it only reimburses costs for those treatments that it assigns a value to. There's also to be aware of the ALD, which is long-term conditions such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease. If this is assigned to you by your doctor, you will receive enhanced and better reimbursements from the state, but still only up to the set figures by the state. Looking at actual figures for a couple in their late 50s or 60s who are early retirees, perhaps moving to France, if you're considering a mutual, you need to budget at least €100 a month. And that can be a little bit less. It can be a great deal more, depending on what kind of features. Obviously, the more features you have to a mutual top-up policy, the more things that it pays for to reduce your out-of-pocket costs, then the higher your cost will be. And if you're thinking about insurance for before you have French social security, you really need to be thinking of at least several €100 a month.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. And that's the same for British expats and for French nationals. It's not just a situation for expats.
No. In the system, everybody is treated the same. It's simply how you apply for that cover and how it's paid for and how you're registered. Once you have a carte vitale and a French social security number, everybody has the same care.
That's great. Thank you, Helen. Mike, someone has asked, if they become French resident, what are the disadvantages in the medium term, say 5 years plus, if they retain a property in the UK for rental income?
Well, I mentioned briefly before that rental income in the UK is something that needs to be disclosed on a UK tax return as well as a French tax return. And there's the interaction of the double tax treaty to make sure that tax isn't paid twice on the same income stream. But it's a complication often that clients don't appreciate to start with. Also, when we get round to selling property like that, there are capital gains tax implications. And again, the UK wants to know what the gain is on the sale. They have a process where within 30 days of the sale, there needs to be disclosure of any gain that there's been. And France wants to know as well. So there's a need for the two taxing entities to sort of dovetail together. But at the end of the day, of course, retaining property once you've been in France as a resident for more than 5 years, retaining property anywhere in the world will bring wealth tax implications if the overall value exceeds 1.3 million. So in a nutshell, it's probably not surprising that France has got this reputation as a high tax area, and actually it's not. I think it's just a matter of having the right tools in the toolbox to minimize the implications of it. But a lot of people coming out of the UK who retain property for rental income purposes will probably consider over that first 5-year period whether it's worthwhile, particularly as they start to face a wealth tax problem after the 5-year point.
Okay, thank you. Mike. Joanna, we've been asked, how does having left the EU impact the ability to buy a property? Have any purchasing conditions or fees changed? And are there limits on how long you can stay at your property? Well, Joe, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, the actual buying process hasn't changed at all. So it will be exactly the same if, as a French person would buy a property in France, the same as Australians, Americans, and people that we have sold to in the past. So Brexit hasn't actually changed the process, and there's no extra costs involved in buying a property in France. However, the term that you can actually stay in the property, if you don't apply for residency, if you're going to be moving to France, then you would need to apply for residency now, and you would have to apply for a carte séjour, which would give you the residency. But for holiday homes, where you used to be able to come for under 183 days, which makes you a fiscal residence over that, you can now only come for 90 days. So that is the difference. So you can come for 3 months, but then you'd have to leave for 3 months anywhere in Europe and then come back in again 3 months later. It doesn't really seem to be a problem for most holiday homeowners, because most holiday homeowners will be working, so they wouldn't have 90 days holiday or 3 months off work anyway. But it does if you can work from home and you were planning on spending 6 months in France. However, you can apply for longer term visas, which I think you're going to talk about later, Karen, on visas.
Yeah, well, as you say, it's not such a problem for holiday homeowners, most of whom who don't want to spend more than 3 or can't spend more than 3 months at their holiday home. But if you want to stay longer, there's the 2 main visas you can apply for. If you want to stay for up to 6 months at a time in France, you need to apply for a temporary long stay visa, the VLST visitor. If you want to move to France or stay there for 6 to 12 months within a single year, you'll need a full long stay visa, which is the VLSTS, which may sound exactly the same as the one I just said, but it's got a crucial extra S in it. And that's equivalent to the French residency. And there's various kinds of them. There's one for people who won't be working or running a business, for example, like retirees, and another for entrepreneurs setting up their own business and other people who are taking up employment in France. You can read more in depth about all the visas on our website, completefrance.com, including how to apply for a visa. One of the conditions, Mike, one for you, I think this is, one of the conditions to obtaining a visa is having sufficient income. A few people have asked about this. How much money per person or couple is required to show you can support yourself? Asks one person. Someone else has said, if they're moving to France as early retirees and will be living on savings until pensions kick in, will this satisfy the minimum income requirement, and what proof would be needed? And another question, someone's leaving employment to move to France, so they can't prove an income but plans to run a B&B or a gîte once there. Is that a possibility?
Blimey, sounds like questions to a politician, this. So it's difficult to know which one to start with first. It's complicated now, isn't it? I mean, it was so much easier in the old days before Brexit happened and before the withdrawal agreement terms expired. And now it's got to a level where, I think that people are well advised to seek specialist help here. There are people, relocation experts, that have got this all well and truly buttoned down now. And I know that we rely on firms locally to us to help us with the relocation matters and deciding with the clients which the right visa is. And as you say, I mean, for most people, treating France and property that they own in France as a holiday retreat, the 90-day factor is perhaps all they need. But for those wanting to stay longer, there's all sorts of funny options now, which I think requires sort of specialist help along the way. And it became clear to everybody really as we develop this conversation this afternoon that none of us know everything about everything. We rely very heavily on complementary service providers, specialists, experts to provide skills that we don't have. I mean, Joe with the property side of things, and there's the legal side of things, the financial and the tax side of things, and they all need to come together. And that includes a visa specialist, in my opinion, to bring it all together and enable us to give the right advice to the client at the right time. And that's really where I would suggest that we move with this. With regard to the minimum income requirement, well, I think that the bar is sort of set now around about the French minimum wage level, which, as I understand it at the moment, has just increased to €1,554 a month. Now, that's just a guide, because we've had experience of quite a few where the conditions are that there is not that same level of income, but there are other assets in the background that are giving financial support or savings there, or pension income or rental income. And it's a combination of all these different factors, because at the end of the day, of course, it's an immigration matter now, and there are no guarantees that any application would be successful. And so I really think that a visa specialist is somebody in our armoury now that we do need to be able to guide people properly through the new rules and regulations.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I know we've been told when we contacted the French consulate about the minimum wage equivalent, that we were told that would actually suffice for a couple and 3 children, and also that savings and pensions will be taken into account, and also that if you can prove you own your own property and aren't paying a mortgage or rent, that will be taken into account, and the amount may be lowered accordingly. So as you say, it is a complicated subject. There are relocation specialists that will help people with this. As I already mentioned, we've got quite a lot on our website as well, and there are you can go online and fill out a questionnaire on the official visas site to find out what visa you actually need to apply for. As I say, you can go onto our website and find out some more information about that. But just while we're on the subject, one for Helen. Somebody's asked what sort of healthcare provision do they need to have in order to get a visa?
And again, I would second a lot of what Mike said there, which is this is a matter now really for people getting professional advice from visa specialists. From our point of view, we have a variety of solutions we can offer to people, whether you're looking for a 90-day insurance, a 180-day or a 1 year. There are plenty of solutions out there, but understanding exactly what you need for your visa application is now quite complex. I would always recommend that you get kind of advice on exactly what the requirements are from a visa specialist. And also, I think, make sure you leave yourself time. I think particularly if you are perhaps an older retired couple and you know that you have pre-existing health conditions, that insurance for that period before you can live somewhere is going to be difficult and more expensive.
Okay, thanks, Helen. And that's something we'll definitely look into for a future webinar, is having a visa and relocation specialist on as well to answer some of the questions. It's now time for our first poll, which should be appearing on your screens now. And it's, what is your time frame for moving to France? Lovely. And moving on now to another question, another tax one for you, Mike. Someone's asked us, do I need to consider inheritance tax at the point of purchase, and does it affect the acquisition structure? So how you buy your property?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned inheritance tax. Of course, that's a UK tax. So I'm making the assumption for a minute that we're talking about a holiday home. But if not, you'll have to just correct me on that one. But I mean, yes, succession or inheritance tax needs a lot of careful thought when we're buying property. And for example, do we buy it in one person's name? Do we buy it in joint ownership? Do we involve children in the ownership of it? Do we have a corporate structure around us, which is often favoured by UK nationals who are purchasing property in France as a holiday retreat? And the reason for this is that succession law in France is very different from the UK. And it needs presenting properly to people who are purchasing property in France, because they might be surprised to know that you don't have total control over where your asset will end up. It follows a particular set of rules and regulations. And in fact, those rules and regulations are up for review from August, and maybe by November, we will know whether the forced heirship rules are going to be imposed more actively in terms of property ownership than they were before, particularly for UK nationals who were able to override French law, and that might not be possible in November, although there's a lot of discussion and negotiation, I'm sure, going on at the moment about whether the rules will change a lot. So yeah, I would say very definitely that succession and inheritance need very careful consideration when you're buying property in France, because the legal rules are all different.
Okay, and also obviously it can have a big impact on the tax too, can't it? Because if you're leaving to your spouse or your children, it's very different to leaving, for example, to your stepchildren or your brother or sister, which is taxed much more highly. So definitely an area to look into carefully. And as before, we have lots of articles on inheritance law and tax on our website. So right, moving on to a completely different question. Joanna, running holiday accommodation in France is always popular with British expats who still need to bring in an income. And we've been asked which parts of France are seeing the best return on investment for properties run as B&Bs or gîtes. And is this now the easiest route to living in France by buying a business? Someone wants to know.
Well, yeah, lots of Brits do move over, and chambre d'hôtes and gîtes are the most popular things to do. There's no real particular area because France has 82 million tourists visiting a year, and everybody goes to different regions. The most popular are generally the ones where Brits buy anyway, in the sort of Normandy, Brittany, the Loire Valley, all the way down to the Languedoc-Roussillon, Côte d'Azur and the Alps. The rental season is generally between April and September. So if you're looking at rentals or supplementing your income, that would be the main months for most areas, unless you buy in the Alps. The Alps has all year round rental income, because in some resorts, for example, like Chamonix, they actually have more tourists in the summer than they do in the ski season. So it really depends on what your budget is and where you want to go. But with 82 million tourists, you are guaranteed to have enough revenue and clients coming through to fill the chambre d'hôtes or the gîte business, and it still is very, very popular in France. It's not sort of the hotel industry that you would see in other countries. It is much more holiday homes, holiday rentals and chambre d'hôtes.
Okay, lovely, thanks. And on the same subject, holiday lets, Mike, someone's asked, we'd like to move to France and earn a small income with the gîte business. What are the key implications, tax and otherwise, following Brexit? And how much does the French government charge in taxes if you let out your holiday property?
Well, I suppose over the years, France has encouraged the expansion of tourist rental income and introduced a number of simplified tax structures to help make this easy to declare to the French tax authorities. But because it always needs putting on a French tax return at the end of the day, whether you're resident or not. Brexit hasn't affected the terms of the Anglo-French double tax treaty. It's kept it all in place. There are important aspects of it that avoid tax, as I said before, being paid twice on the same income stream. But, France probably generally has a higher level of tax for general income than the UK, and we've got the dreaded social charges as well to bear in mind as well. That can have an impact for those who are resident in France. So it's another tax complication, really, that was tried to be simplified, but really at the end of the day, it becomes a pretty complicated issue to get the structure right and minimise the impact of tax for you in France.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Helen, what do people need to be aware of with regards to house insurance in France? We've been asked. And do they need extra insurance if they rent out the property or have sheets?
Okay, but again, like many of these things, insurance in France is different to the UK, which is a shock to some people when they come here. Home insurance specifically is different. In the UK, your home insurance is likely to be an all-risk insurance where the reason for the claim is irrelevant and doesn't matter, whereas in France it is a multi-risk policy, and you'll be insured for a series of defined risks such as fire, water damage, climatic events, natural disasters, technological disasters, attacks and acts of terrorism, and glass breakage. And when you make a claim, it needs to be within that risk, and particularly looking at things such as natural disasters or climatic events, you'll need to have a statement of this from your local mairie or proof to show that the event took place and to justify your claim. The home insurance also includes responsibility civil, which is your public liability, which covers you for any damage you or the members of your household, your entourage, might cause to other people or to their belongings. But when we're looking at for people who want to let out their holiday home, you just need to let your insurer know upfront, and those clauses can be added to ensure that you have that additional insurance and protection for that purpose.
Okay, thank you. We've got another buying question now. Joanna, with unexpected travel dynamics, how much of the transaction purchase can now be completed remotely? I mean, can people actually buy a property like, you know, from their living room in the UK?
Yes, you can. Obviously, the last two years, the market's changed completely. And in fact, about 25% of our sales were bought virtually, where the clients didn't actually come to see the house until sort of now. However, we have been doing that for quite a while, because a lot of our Australian clients, for example, do buy virtually and are able to do that process. But what has changed, obviously, since the pandemic is that the notaires are now allowing things to be signed without having to be in the notaire's office. In some instances, if you're getting a mortgage, then you may need to go to a notary public in the UK, if you're in the UK or whatever country you're in, and sign something in front of them. But you don't necessarily have to be in France. Everything can be done by DocuSign. So we use DocuSign an awful lot on compromis de vente, so you don't have to keep coming out to France. And again, the final acts can now be done by proxy, so you don't actually have to be here at all. So it's a totally different market to what it used to be back in the day.
Wow, that's quite something, isn't it? And presumably people will want to get back to France and they will want to be looking at properties in question. But now that there's the ability to do it all from a distance virtually, I guess it could be very handy for people if they want to look at a load of properties maybe virtually and then narrow it down to just a few properties to actually go and see. So it could be a good thing going forward.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, with the tools that we have now, like WhatsApp and things like that, you know, agents can actually go around the property, do virtual visits. They can zoom in on something that the client physically wants to see. We do a lot of virtual tours anyway online instead of photographs. So you can sort of look up and down the ceilings, the floors, etc. And our agents have driven into villages and, you know, in the car and videoed going around the village, how far it is from the shops, that type of thing. So, you know, in the old days, you probably wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't even buy a pair of shoes online because I'd be worried they're going to come back wrong. But these days, you can do things much more virtually, even purchasing a house.
Fantastic, thank you. Mike, we touched on inheritance tax earlier. Someone's asked more specifically, what would your recommendation be to minimise the inheritance tax impact if we have no children, i.e. leaving our holiday home to our siblings?
Well, this is a tricky one, isn't it? I think the starting point is where I got to before. You know, we need to know, to start with, who owns the property. So is it in sole name? Is it jointly with husband and wife team? Is it in a corporate structure? Quite normal. But generally, I mean, siblings are not normally classified as protected heirs in terms of French law, where there is a continuing spouse or parents or children in the mix. So we need to, if you want to specify that your siblings are the ones that are going to benefit from it, and these particular individuals would probably need to apply to do a French will, applying Brussels 4, which is this peculiar overwriting French law provision which is available at the moment, to be able to be sure that the asset will pass to the siblings as opposed to anybody else. But I think really the starting point is a bit more detail about who owns the property and how they own it.
Okay, thank you. Right, okie dokie. Helen, someone's asked, this is a good one, yes, a good one for you, because you've obviously lived in France for quite a while, so presumably you'll have good experience with this. How do living costs and local taxes compare in France to the UK?
It's a interesting one and gets a lot of interest on Facebook groups as well. I know that one. There's the taxe d'habitation and taxe foncière, which are their household taxes, which I know Mike's referred to previously, and the income tax. The two house taxes are kind of similar to council tax. They can be higher. Again, a lot of this depends on your family structure, as you're taxed as a family here in France, as a family group, as opposed to an individual. Possibly kind of a slightly higher tax base than in the UK. Food, I would say, generally is more expensive, but it's more based on buying locally, buying seasonally, and it very much depends on how you live and what you like. Wine, generally much better. Childcare and the costs associated with that, sports clubs and activities, much cheaper than the UK, I've found. And I think one of the big things that people don't consider, from my point of view, in the UK, I lived in a 3-bedroom detached house with modern insulation and gas central heating. And here in France, I live in a much larger house, which was older. It's heated with a wood-fired stove. I don't have gas. And so it's very, very difficult to make direct comparisons. Your costs just will vary and your lifestyle changes, and so it's difficult to put figures on those costs.
Okay, yeah, very difficult to compare like for like, as you say. You can change your lifestyle, but that is the reason why most people live in France in the first place. Okay,
and which of us would change that? Not me.
Well, that's good to hear. Very good to hear. Mike, we've had a few questions about pensions, including, can I claim a British state pension and private pensions once I've moved to France? How long do you need to have been working in the UK to qualify for claiming a pension from France? And how do you claim pensions when living in France? Do you need to retain a UK bank account?
All right, okay, well, this is something that again, Brexit doesn't seem to have interfered with, thank goodness. But being in France doesn't stop you from claiming your UK pension. You can claim that very easily, provided you're entitled to it through the website or wherever. The UK pensions are payable, providing you've made at least 10 years contributions to your national insurance record. And you'll benefit also from future inflationary adjustments to it, referred to more recently by politicians as this triple lock. And France is very much the same as well. I mean, similar qualification rules, eligibility, and easy to claim, very easy to claim. The bigger thing, I think, with all this lot is not so much the state pensions. State pensions can be payable to any bank that you might like. UK pensions can go into UK bank, but equally they go into a French bank account and be paid in euros if you like. So it's very flexible, the claiming and the direction in which the cash actually ends up. The bigger picture, of course, is private and occupational pensions, where there are very many other options and opportunities really to plan your exit from the UK in a more tax efficient manner, rather than leaving all these decisions until you are firmly in France. And one good example of that is typically known as the pension cash lump sum, not out of state pensions, but out of private and occupational pensions, which should really be taken if you would needed it before you left the UK, because if not, it's tax-free in the UK and it's taxable when you arrive in France. So we really need to look at pensions in the round, find out what to do, when to trigger the income stream in, and what the tax advantages are about taking action before you leave the UK and before you arrive firmly in France.
Okay, so as with most things, planning plenty of time ahead is key.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the one thing I would say now, that we're getting people coming to us once we've gone through the withdrawal agreement and the September issue. Then it's all about people planning in the longer term, a couple of years away from perhaps when they might feel comfortable coming, but they're entering into a dialogue with people now who can talk to them about what the issues are. I think it's all fairly straightforward now. And this is where people are planning, coming from all around the world into Europe now, and making contact with businesses like ours through the website and asking for information, just like we're explaining today.
Great, thanks, Mike. It's now time for our second poll. Okay, let's move on to another question. Joanna, one for you. This is a question we always receive from French Property News readers and visitors to our exhibitions, and it is, where can we find the cheapest houses in France?
Well, there are cheap properties in every area. It depends on the size of the property that you want. But if you go by average house prices, the very cheapest areas are the sort of Limousin and the cruise areas, which are kind of central to France. There you could get a 3-bedroom house in the cruise, for example, for 63,000 euros is the average house price there. So it's really, really good value for money. However, France, in comparison to the UK, is so much cheaper, similar to cheaper to Spain as well. So it is very, very cost effective, and it depends what you want. You know, if you've got a big family and you want a big property with lots of land, but you're on a really small budget, then areas like the Limousin and the cruise would be the best areas for you. If you've got slightly more, then it could be the Charente, the Aquitaine. Brittany's really, really cost effective as well. You can get really lovely properties there in Brittany and Normandy. The further south you go, the higher the values. If you were looking at the Languedoc-Roussillon, which is in the south of France, you'd be looking at around 180,000 for an average 3-bedroom home. If you go over to Cannes, you'd be looking at 330. And again, if you go into the Alps, because of the sort of rental incomes that they can achieve, it is slightly higher there as well. But the cheapest area, without doubt, is in the centre of France, in the cruise.
Lovely. I mean, those rural areas that lots of Brits really love. So that's good news. Okay, right, let's have a look. Helen, I think this is a good one for you. So you already mentioned your children. Someone's asked about the school system in France.
Yeah, it's quite if you're bringing your family, it's definitely for a concern for people. There are international schools in and around France and international sections, but they are generally private, probably more expensive. I put my children in the French system. There is support for children starting in the French system or for non-English, non-French speakers, but that will very much depend where you live, how readily accessible and how good that support is. Children start school at 3 in France, going into Petit Section. And the system itself has GCSE, the equivalent of GCSEs is the brevet, which they do the year younger. They do that at 15. And then there is the baccalaureate, which they do at 18, which is broadly equivalent to around 4 A levels. It's quite broad spectrum. And there's also the opportunity for children to do the option international baccalaureate with various different language sections. My children did with the British section. And if they're then looking at going back to the UK, my daughter had offers from UK universities to study there. She's chosen to stay in France, but it would have been fine for her to go either way that she chose. It can be quite tough, particularly in the first months and the first years, and just, you know, remember that. But I know that 8 years on, my children, all 3 of them, quite happy, very settled, and, you know, happy to be here. And they'd even say that themselves if they were here.
How wonderful to be bilingual as you're growing up. That's
exactly.
So, okay, back to tax, Mike. Someone's asked, what are the capital gains implications for selling a main residence in France and returning to the UK?
Well, this is the whole subject of capital gains tax and selling main residences. Probably is the biggest number of inquiries we get every week in our post box. And it is because generally some advice recommends that there is a period of grace after having sold it and you go back to the UK and you still are able to claim main residence exemption for capital gains tax purposes. We don't go with that. The safest way to plan for tax-free return journey by selling your home in France is to sell it before you leave. And the reason for that is that in France, generally, it encourages a system of interpretation of the basic rules. And we find that in different departments, there are different interpretations of the same legislation. And that often cuts people into a bit of a raw nerve, where they find that because they thought that there was an element of wriggle room, the particular department they're dealing with doesn't agree with it. And then there's a big argument about whether the gain on the property is tax-free as a main residence or not. France is very simplistic about it. If it is your main residence at the point when you sell it and you're in it at that time, it's tax-free. And the same actually goes for the UK. There are options available, but generally we would recommend that you should be in it when you sell it and then leave afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Joanna, we've been asked, what are the towns, not cities, with the largest percentage of English-speaking people?
Well, I couldn't say in general which towns have the most. I mean, realistically, there are Brits all over France in all different areas. The least is probably in the Côte d'Azur, where it's a massively international market, but there are still hundreds of Brits, and it is probably one of the biggest areas where Brits buy. Usually, generally speaking, areas, for example, like the Nouvelle-Aquitaine, which includes the Dordogne, people do think is saturated with Brits, but actually it's not. Even in the sort of highly populated areas, you'd probably only be looking at 5 to 10% of them being British, and not necessarily British. There's lots of Belgians, Dutch, that are all speaking English, but they're not actually Brits. But yeah, there are, you can get sort of British communities all over France, and there's no real specific town that really stands out that's like typically British as such.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, let's have a look. So another one about health insurance. So Helen, someone says they have an existing condition, multiple sclerosis. Will this impact the cost of their top-up insurance, their mutuelle?
Short answer for that is no. For a mutuelle top-up insurance, which supports the French social security system, there's a legal obligation on insurers to not consider pre-existing conditions. Generally, you'll see that prices increase with age. And I will say, if you're looking at very, very top end, very, very full policies, they may apply a health questionnaire to those, but you will not be unable to get insurance, and you will not be excluded from good across the board basic policies. It's the area to consider is when you first move across to France, and that's going to be when it's difficult.
Okay, that's well, that sounds like good news for people with existing conditions. So great. Let's see, Mike, another tax one. Is there a tax advantage if a couple hold a property in a single name in the UK and a single name in France? So they have one each, I guess.
You know, if it is traditional anymore, cohabiting couple, I would have said there was no real advantage at all, but that doesn't happen always these days. We often find that couples are following careers in different countries. It's very, very strange how the world has sort of moved on, and they choose to keep the marriage going, but carry on working and living in different environments. Now, I could see in those circumstances, because the UK tax system deals with individual taxpayers rather than households, I could see that being an advantage where, for example, one spouse could sell a property in the UK and claim it was the main residence, and the other spouse could do the same thing in France. But generally, I wouldn't have thought that there was an awful lot of an advantage of being able to hold properly separately like that. And in fact, for succession, it would often be better that it was owned jointly. So I would probably be arguing down that particular line. But as I say, the law is very different in France compared to the UK, and we need to look under the bonnet and see what's going on and precisely what will happen in the event of one spouse dying. And that's where we need to bring the legals in, the notaire function in France, to make sure all these issues are covered off properly.
Lovely. Okay, thank you, Mike. Joanna, we've had a question. It says, we are two families looking to buy a property to share with a budget of £300,000 combined equally. Can you give us any tips on how to do this? The thinking is that since we can only spend 90 of 180 days in France, why not pool resources and share a bigger, better place?
Yes, you can obviously do this. You probably need to set it up as an SCI, which is like a corporate purchase, so that each person in that group would have different shares in the property. So if, for example, one of them wanted to get out of it, they could sell to somebody else. I mean, I'm obviously not a tax advisor or wouldn't be able to set that up as an agency, but we can put you in touch with notaires, or you could speak to an English solicitor in the UK that deals with French property, and they can set that process up for you. There is obviously a cost because you're setting up a corporation, so there would be a fee for setting up, but that's the safest and easiest route to do that. Or you can buy the property in all of the names, so that you're all sort of co-owners of the property, and then it's not an SCI. But the problem you have there is if somebody wants to get out, do you have to sell the whole property, or can they sort of buy in shares, which is probably not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to do. So the best thing I would do is to speak to the local notaire. They can advise you on which is the best way to set up, or an English advisor in the UK.
Okay, and not just for holiday homes. I mean, this is something we're seeing more and more with readers of French Property News, that a lot of extended families are looking to move to France and buy a bigger place. So yeah, definitely an interesting one to follow. Okay, Mike, you touched on wealth tax earlier. Somebody has asked, for the wealth tax, which is property over 1.3 million euros, are you taxed only on the amount that is above 1.3 million? And if so, what is the percentage of that tax?
Okay, well, generally for France, certain properties, if it's your main residence, it's entitled to a small discount, 30% on the notional value of it. And mortgages, to a certain extent, can be offset. But if the net value of your interest in property is more than 1.3 million, then yes, tax is charged, and the starting point is at 800,000. It's a historical issue to do with France. So even if it's €1 over the top of 1.3 million, and the starting point to work out the tax is 800,000. And then it works out at 0.5% on the first 500,000, 0.7% on the next 1.27 million, right the way up to property values in excess of 10 million, where it's 1.5%. So it's creeping up quite a lot. I mean, you need to understand, though, you know, for people becoming resident in France with worldwide property interests, in the first 5 years of having become resident, it's only the French properties that are assessed for wealth tax purposes. The properties outside of France are exempt in the first 5 years. Gives people the chance, if you like, to realise some of those property interests and turn it into other things that are less tax sensitive. But it's an important part of the planning process. But other people, including non-residents, who've got property interests in France that amount to more than 1.3 million, are straight into the tax situation. And then, as I said before, the tax rates start at 800,000.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Helen, insurance one. What other insurance do people moving to France need to be aware of? I mean, driving insurance immediately springs to my mind, but is there anything else people might not expect?
Yeah, I think there's as we discussed before when I mentioned home insurance, responsibility civil, public liability is something people probably don't know about. And linked to that is school insurance that you need. If you have children of school age, they will need a school insurance that insures them for their public liability, but also against accidents for themselves and that they might cause. The things to bear in mind are, if you're renting a property in France, then it's a legal obligation to have home insurance, because the cost of any claim will be shared, they're shared between the tenant and the owner, depending on the type of claim and what's done. And obviously this is set in law, but it is a legal obligation to have that home insurance in place. The other linked to that is the fact that it is also a legal obligation to have car insurance for any car that you own in France. There's no such concept as off the road with a car stored. You're obliged to have a minimum of third-party insurance for all your vehicles that you own. Thinking about like moving to a whole new life abroad, it's easy to remember to insure your things, the goods, but you have to remember to insure the person and your life as well. You're living in a new country, in a kind of things that you might not necessarily kind of be familiar with. And so thinking about things like, what will you do if you have a serious accident, if you have a serious illness? What will you do if you die while you're living abroad? And think about putting insurances in place so that you can deal with that and your loved ones can deal with that easily on your behalf. Thinking about opening bank accounts, we can do that for you as soon as you've signed a compromis de vente, so that you've got everything ready when you land in France and can hit the ground running. And I would just, for people coming from outside of France to live here, when you have a foreign kind of driving history, you're not used to kind of the different provisions of house insurance, think about getting in touch with a specialist provider such as ourselves. That's what we deal with. We deal with people who have that situation. We've been through it ourselves, and we'll understand the pitfalls that, say, an online French insurer won't even know to make you aware of.
Okay, thanks, Helen. We're coming to the end of our session, and it's been really great to see we've got participants have joined us from all over the world. We've had a few questions from Americans and Australians who are wanting to know, is the buying process in any way different for them from, say, British buyers? Is the tax situation different? Is the insurance different? I'm guessing that most of it is the same because we're all non-EU. But over to you three. Mike, is the tax situation different?
No, I mean, it's strange, isn't it? I mean, you've had contact from Australians. We've got people from the Emirates contacting us, and Hong Kong, and it's amazing. But no, I would have thought that Joe will be able to comment on this, that the buying process is exactly the same now as it's always been. Brexit, fortunately, doesn't seem to have been anything that's interfered with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Joanna, the buying process for Americans as opposed to Brits, or as opposed to...
It is exactly the same process as we would go through even as a French person. The only thing that slightly is different, and it could actually affect British buyers as well, is finance. It's quite, there's only a certain amount of banks that will lend out of the EU as if it's not a permanent resident. So that's something that there is banks that will do it. But again, it could happen now with Brits. There's less banks lending to British people looking for mortgages now because we're out of the EU. But the buying process itself is exactly the same. There's absolutely no difference between an American buying a property to a French person buying a property. So the buying process remains the same.
Great. And Helen, any differences in insurance that people should be aware of?
No, I just second what everybody else says, really, which is there's really no difference. Just to make sure you've got somebody who's familiar with dealing with people that have come from outside France, really.
Okay, fantastic. So that wraps up our seminar on a webinar even on moving to France. Thank you all for joining us. I hope it's been useful. But you can also contact us with any other further questions you have. Thank you very much to my fellow panelists, Mike, Joanna and Helen. Thanks also to our sponsor, Blevins Franks. They have a guide to living in France, which can be purchased on their website. For more information about France and French property, please do visit our websites, our own websites, which are completefrance.com and francepropertyshop.com. You can also find information there about our magazines, French Property News and France Magazine, including subscriptions. I hope to see you on our next webinar. Keep an eye out on our French Property Exhibitions website, and yeah, I hope to see you then. Thank you everyone for joining us.